Okay, I think we are officially live. It is IKYA Live, world news from the spiritual perspective. My name is Andy, I'm operations manager here at IKYA Center. And tonight, this is the program that gives you real spiritual advice for real life, for your spiritual path. And tonight's topic is exciting and really challenging. It's 1 year on in the war in Ukraine, and yeah, it's unfolding in ways expected and unexpected. We posed a really challenging question tonight about that war in Ukraine. Is it the end of our way of life here in the West especially, or is it a new beginning? And we were having sort of a pre-show discussion before we got started, and the question arose, especially the movements that China's been making in the past few weeks. Those seem to hint at that things are heating up again, but maybe from a different direction, and really highlighting this question of, is the world choosing a direction for the future? And I think that's where we want to turn it over to IKYA to start with that question. IKYA, is China starting to make signals that the world is really directly discussing the way forward through this war in Ukraine? So just a moment, everybody. We are going to try this. Okay, IKYA, can you give us a try again?
Okay. Does it work now? Good. Yeah. Now, before I say anything, first I'd like to ask everyone to lift their awareness beyond the world of politics, because this is not really a political show, it's a spiritual show. So try to lift your awareness and try to look at it from the outside. Think of yourself as a spiritual being just visiting this planet, and then looking at what's happening for the spiritual benefit of humans and all life on this planet, not from having any particular viewpoint or opinion, just seeing this unfoldment and wanting to figure out what's actually going on, right? So let's keep it on that level and try to stay away from politics and conspiracy theories and all of that crap, right? And try to be in a state of spiritual journey, not just for yourself, but the spiritual journey of the whole planet. So when it comes to China, what's happening now is China is just teasing and trying to figure out how to weaken the West even more. Because remember that democracy is at this point on its deathbed. And we might not like to hear this, but people around the world, they don't like democracy, right? When you look at human history, dictatorship has been the only form of government, and still is pretty much. Democracy is a small, tiny blip in history, an anomaly. And most people don't want it, because if that's what they wanted, that's what we would have. And even people in the West don't really want it anymore, because we are moving in a different direction. People are flirting with, authoritarian leaders and ways of thinking. And It's really because democracy is not natural for humans. What is natural is hierarchies, power, tribalism, all of that. Democracy is very difficult for humans because it means that it's not about fighting your enemies, it's about listening to them. And humans are not good at that. Just look at your own relationships, right? It's not easy. And then we're trying to do this on a collective scale. It takes a lot of work. Just like in any relationship, we need the willingness to let everyone be listened to. And even in today's climate, when people demand to be listened to, it's mostly about still fighting their enemies. And, when we look at what's happened in the West in general, and the whole thing around democracy is that we start to take it for granted because our lives are so comfortable that we have nothing to fight for. And the fights we have are just, decadent. So when we have our needs met, what normally happens when we get too much comfort is that we want even more comfort and we want it now. So instead of standing up for the values we've had in the West, we've fallen into consumerism. Also when it comes to values, we want what we want and we want it now. And whenever we can't get what we want, we need to complain, we need to blame someone because we're not responsible, someone else. So we create the image of them, right? The big them. They are responsible. And when we want what we want, we become very aggressive. Remember that humans are extremely aggressive to start with. We're aggressive, we're hierarchical. We're not peaceful. We're peaceful when we all agree. When we don't agree, we become aggressive. So when we then want what we want and we create the story of them, from that moment on, we become tribalistic. And what we've seen in the West is that we become, we're moving into that kind of tribal way of thinking, us and them. And there are lots of thems because they are always responsible. We are right, and when we fall into comfort, we become more primitive because we follow our instincts and urges, right? I want this, I want that. This is right for me. This is my truth. And we think because we feel something that it's righteous, that it's important, and everyone else should listen. So when we have too much comfort, we start moving away from the idea of democracy. And we blame and we become aggressive. And this is where we are in the West right now. It's always about blaming someone. Nobody wants to take responsibility for anything. It's always them. And look at, no matter where we go in politics to today, in the West, it's never about anyone taking responsibility. It's always about blaming someone, right? So this is how we lose the democracy. And we become more primitive, more instinct-based. Democracy requires the ability to think, being abstract, to reflect, to not look at yourself and your own opinions as always being right. Understanding that it's in the discussions, it's in the conversations that we find solutions that we all can live with. But when we become tribal, it's about winning, killing your enemies. And you see that today. People have less and less patience with other people and other people's opinions. And in politics, it's not really about just discussing, really discussing things anymore. It's just about blame and appealing to your own audience, your tribe. And this is how we lose democracy. It's the path to dictatorships. And this is, when you want to win, you want to dictate other people how to live their lives and what they should think and do. So you want a dictator that represents you so that that person can force everybody else so you can win, right? It's very primitive. And this is more in line with human nature than democracy. Democracy takes a lot of work. And in the West, we've taken it for granted. And it's slipping. And this is part of what we're seeing now also with a question in regard to China, is that both Russia and China, they see the opportunity now to basically kill democracy and kill the values of the West by being at war. Remember that this is World War III. It is. And it's just being fought in many different ways. This is not just a hybrid war. It's a very complex war that's been going on for a very long time. And if we were to talk about when it started, I think it's more fair to say that the moment a war ends, the next one begins. Because you have that buildup of conflict and tension, and then you have the manifestation of war. So the war we're seeing now is very complex, and this is why many people can't truly see that this is World War III. Because what China and Russia has been doing, for instance, through social media in the West is fascinating. How they've been able to amplify our tendencies to move into tribalism, right? And through false information and all of that. And we let them because they pay for advertising, right? It's really stupid, but it's also part of people in the West having fallen asleep and not really standing up for the values we represent. And both China and Russia have been able to weaken the ideals of the West so much that they think now we're going in for the kill. So China is doing whatever they can. And so is Russia. So of course, they hope that we now can move into a world where the West is not setting the agenda anymore. And we are. The kind of reign of the West is over. And we can like it or not, but it's just a fact. Other cultures are on the move. They're moving up, and we have to relate to a more complex world. A complex world where most people prefer dictatorships. And why do we prefer dictatorships? It's the tribalism thing. If you have a dictator that represents you and your values and your narratives, that's what you want, because then you feel that you're winning. And remember also, in a dictatorship, you will be presented with a narrative that you want to hear, if you're among the supporters. You can have the narrative of we're all good and, everything on the surface is right, and that's what you want to hear. Most people do not want to look behind the curtain and see what's really going on. Even in the West, we're like this. One example I often use is that of slavery. One area that I find really entertaining, because we can all agree today that slavery was a terrible thing. And the wokesters, they get people canceled. Historical figures are canceled because they owned slaves or did not do enough to abolish slavery. And they write their stuff on their iPhones that are partially made by slaves. Right? And it's too complex to compute that there are more slaves in the world today than in any other time of human history. And I don't see them trying to do anything about that, because that means that they couldn't buy their precious products cheap products or technology. Because when we buy a piece of technology somewhere in that production line, you will find slaves. The world economy is still partially based on slavery. So it's that. We don't want to know because we're good people. And in a dictatorship, you have a sanitized narrative. And then whatever goes on, you don't want to know about it. And that's how people are. Democracy is too difficult. So what we're doing in the West, we have to figure out if we actually want democracy or not. And again, what Russia and what China is doing is simply the energy that is now getting floating to the surface because we are too weak. Remember that from a spiritual point of view, if it's this or that, it doesn't really matter. It's not like democracy is better. It's not like the Western values somehow are spiritually more aligned. They're not. It's just a variation of human consciousness. And it's simply now a discussion, between these different paradigms. And all of them have to die. I often say that Europe really has to die because modern civilization was built first in Europe and then exported. So for the world to move into more of a globalized consciousness, Europe has to die and be reinvented. And this is part of what's going on. It's absolutely necessary. And what you see with these different players in this war, it's just different forms of old consciousness. It still does not represent anything but the resistance and the old karma, because remember that when we are to move forward as a planet and to lift the consciousness, we have to work out the old karma. And whenever something is being amplified, the resistance and the conflicts will arise, and they will become a lot more potent. And this is what we're seeing. So in a way, we just have to relax and look at it. So this has to play itself out. Now, as many of you are aware of, I have for several decades talked about the potential of a nuclear war based on this conflict in 2024. And I've been talking to a lot of individuals about this, and also what is needed to avoid it. The nuclear war is still on the table. It can still happen if humans really want to destroy themselves, but most likely there will be a different pathway. So this is, in many ways, simply old karma being burned out. There is no other alternative. What we need to look at is what happens after, right? So yes, this is the end of our world as we know it, and it's also a new beginning. Do we have any questions?
No questions yet.
Okay.
What about here in the audience? Christian, maybe you had a question?
Many questions, but I have to pick one then. So you okay. So I go back to this talk you had about democracies and autocracies, and I got understanding you say most of the people don't want democracies.
Yeah.
But I feel the opposite. People in the autocracies don't have the chance to leave the democracy, leave it for democracies, because there is no option. But the majority in the democracies, they want to stay in that aura. We fight for it now. But you think this is the last fight we have, and then disappear.
Okay, something that's real important to understand is that the leaders are the product of the consciousness of the people. It's not the other way around. Most dictators are elected. That's how it starts. And if people truly wanted change, they can make it happen. Revolutions have happened many times. People are in majority, but they don't want it enough. And again, dictatorships are extremely comfortable, although they're also unpleasant. They're very comfortable. It's more in line with human nature. People can think that they want to make choices. They don't. They want to choose between palatable options, like what flavor of ice cream do you want? We really don't want to deal with the more difficult aspects of life. Some people do, but also look at, in the West, we become too indulgent. And we have created a society that's basically ruining the whole planet, ruining the environment, ruining each other. And people in the West are, on between 5 and 10 strategies for self-medication at any given moment. We are depressed. We are sick. We're not able to stay in relationships. We don't have kids anymore. We entertain ourselves, to death. We're not healthy. We're not happy. So you can look at like all of that. When they look at what the West has become, like from China and Russia, they see it as a disease. China sees themselves as the adult in the room that will have to save the world from the illness that is now the Western culture, because they also see that the Western culture is completely corrupt. Democracy is not a thing anymore. The United States is now, per definition, an oligarchy. So the state of the West is not as healthy as our own narratives would like it to be. And people just want things to work. Most people do not care about what type of government they have. When you look at human history, people have always preferred to be ruled. They've always preferred dictatorships. That's a constant thing in human history. So democracy is an experiment. And when we look at the results, it's not just pointing in one direction, right? We can basically say that the consciousness is not advanced enough. Because if we were advanced enough also in the West, we might have treated it differently. Also to today, when democracy is under pressure, is anyone really doing anything? No, we just complain and want to blame someone else. Yet again, we become tribal. So what I say is democracy works better in a society where everyone agrees. We now live in a multicultural society with many different ways of thinking and believing and practicing and all of that. And that makes it very difficult, because then we have to listen to everyone. And that's not natural, because the human genetics, the human brain is extremely tribal. It doesn't mean that we should not try, but we're saying that it's a very complex. And even in the West, people are drawn to authoritarian ideas, right? And no, people wanting democracy and other positive, that is something that we are telling ourselves. But when you look, for instance, at the average Chinese, they have a much stronger sense of national pride. I'm not talking about nationalism, but experiencing themselves as having productive, good lives with the purpose than most people in the West. right? So it's understanding that there are many narratives, and it's that the Western narrative and kind of owning the story of what it means to be human, the story of civilization. The Western ownership is dissolving, and we have to accept that there are many stories, many versions of history, and to me that is really exciting. It's really about all voices being heard, because this is where we need to end up. As I said, we're moving towards one planet, one world, but we're far away from that, and we can't even function together. So there is that, and it means everything has to surface, and we have to figure it out, and there will be so much conflict until we get there, but we will. And democracy, the way we have it in the West, is simply not a good model. When we look at it, it's completely corrupt at this point. It doesn't mean that dictatorship is the only option. I'm saying humans have to find something better. And over time, they will.
Yes, we have a question from Sandra in Germany on Zoom. Sandra.
Hi, yes, hello. Hi, here's Sandra from Germany. I have a question, and it's about what would you advise us on how we can live our lives? Because I see there's so much fear around. I have friends, they want to sell their properties because like war is coming. And so what is your advice on how to live our lives? And is there also something how we actually can, as individuals, support the consciousness of love and healing? So it would be very nice. Thank you.
Yeah. Now, I think this is an excellent question. When we look at it, this is an opportunity to focus on what is important. Because when we think of the big failure of the West, it's lack of purpose, lack of understanding what's important, right? Because, you know, being outraged over not receiving the right pizza toppings, you know, that's what we've become, right? And we need to start focusing on what is actually important. And this is also, you know, why we're under pressure. We need to figure out, is there something here? We need to figure out what the core is. And I think also in ourselves, so what are our core values as individuals, as people? Now, as I've said before, the most wonderful part of the Western culture is giving the individual priority over the collective. That is, to me, the most wonderful aspect of Western democracy. It's emphasizing the individual. And it's how we do that in our own lives. Like, what are the values that we think are important? How can we focus on what's actually important? Right? Seeing each other, supporting individuals in their own journeys, to not judge, but to include, to embrace, to celebrate every version of human. Because the West, what we have done in the West is to also open up doors for human possibility. We've been more creative, more innovative, you know, more supportive, like finding out how many ways is there to be human, right? In dictatorships, it's more kind of like strict. People feel safe when they're not exposed to the others. In the West, you know, we have kind of blossomed, and all of that has surfaced, and now it's just this enormous soup of everything, and that is wonderful. So I think also, you know, support anyone, support all expressions, and see it as important, an important value. Now, when it comes to whatever is manifesting, number one, we have to understand that it's absolutely necessary. We're working out the old karma. And it's not possible to move on to a more healing consciousness until we start to work out all of these very primitive conflicts. So it's important to not let oneself be pulled into fear, because then we're part of the problem. If we are in fear, we're definitely not part of the healing. And if we are in resistance, we're also not part of the solution. We need to understand that there is no option, right? This has been a major kind of fork in the road, and it's been there for cycles. You know, we've all been kind of looking forward to these events as the big experimenting, seeing where does human consciousness want to go. And for me, this is just a wonderful thing happening, because it's different, like, platforms of human culture being in discussion about where should we go, what's going on, and making those decisions and moving the collective consciousness closer to more of a wholesome, globalized consciousness. Now, you wouldn't think that when you look at what's happening, but we have to think in longer lines. I'm thinking like next century, right? And what it takes to move into a culture that is more inclusive. So it's always being part of the solution. If we want to point the way, we have to behave like the way. So focusing what's actually important. So yes, definitely, love is important. Seeing and understanding other people. And I think also contributing to people not being so afraid. Humans will get past this. We've been through worse, you know. And one thing I often tell people, that even a nuclear war would not be the worst thing that could possibly happen. And then people go, what? The worst thing that could happen is for this current civilization to keep going. That would have been the worst option. Because that's a path that would have led to the complete annihilation of this human life form and most life forms on this planet. That's the worst option. So this is the change. And as you know, in your own life spiritually, that never happens without a lot of kicking and screaming, you know, from ourselves and sometimes others. Right? Because we have to deal with ourselves. We have to deal with our own karma and resistance. Right? So when this planet is faced with the opportunity to lift its consciousness, everything standing between where we're at and that potential will have to be worked out. And that's what's going on. There is no option if we want to grow. So the reason why all of this is happening is because the collective consciousness of humans have already decided that let's try to lift the consciousness. Otherwise, there would have been no point to this. And just like in our own process, I think this is so important to understand. Shit hits the fan only after you have made the decision to take a step forward. When you want to enter a higher space, then you need to go through this amplified process of working out your karma. Otherwise, there would be no point. So, also with what's happening on the planet, it's because the decision has been made that this planet and this collective life form wants to move up. And this is simply part of releasing all the karma and working everything out that's necessary to get there. So, the worst option being keeping this current civilization going It's not happening. Because everybody understands spiritually that that's the worst thing that could happen. We have to try to lift ourselves and grow out of this primitive childishness. And that's what this is about. And because that decision has been made collectively, it will happen. A lot of kicking and screaming, a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, as it always is when we work on our own karma. And as a planet, there's plenty of karma to work out before we can be a little bit more in harmony with ourselves and with this planet. So try to keep that focus and try to love this process. I think this is the beginning of the healing. This is not the destruction, it's the beginning of the healing.
So what I hear you saying is this process is both necessary and also, in a way, like the best alternative, not the worst one, as challenging as it might look. How how might we then think about the, in a way, service that people like Putin, Trump, all of these leaders, it's a handful of people playing enormously large roles in this process for the entire planet. And yet the human nature is to vilify and caricaturize them. But how could you help us to actually understand a little bit more the gift that they're giving all of us?
By understanding that if they didn't exist, we would have to invent them. They are the product of the collective consciousness, the collective karma. When something externalizes, it's because it's already there as energy, as vibration. So it's already in the consciousness, already part of the collective karma. And then people will gravitate towards individuals that represent that. And I often explain this as the model of the Greek gods, right? Or the Indian gods, where you basically have whatever you need to externalize, well, you will make up some god for that. And then you can worship and then you can do whatever you want. But it will become a character you relate to as an extension of your own mind. So that character will then represent certain aspects that you feel drawn to. That is then simply the externalization of what's going on inside of you. And this is the same thing. When we look at Trump, for instance, right, he was the product of people in the States for a long time feeling marginalized, feeling ridiculed, and not being included. And he was able to communicate in a way that they recognized and they could feel seen. And it's a big part of the population. And so it happens every time. Whenever someone becomes popular, doesn't matter if it's like music or sports or whatever it is, when we elevate them and give them status, it's because they represent something to us. They become the externalization of our own inner process, both individually and collectively. So a person like Putin is simply the product of his own country. And same thing with leaders in other countries. And Xi Jinping, he's definitely also that. You know, when you look at his background as a person, he ticked the right boxes. The right background with parents in the party and all of that. And it's what that country wants. So, but also from a spiritual perspective, when you look at, you know, the journeys of these people, yeah, that's what they need to go through. And the fascinating thing is, when we do something small scale, on a larger scale, it's basically still the same thing. Right? If you bake one chocolate cake or 10,000, it's still the same cake. Volume does not necessarily change anything. It's just like you have, you know, everything becomes clear when it's big scale, right? So if you're just like dealing with the stuff in your own relationship is one thing, but if you're dealing with 100 million people, you can see different patterns and you can experiment differently. So their personal journeys are what they are, but they still are in harmony with the collective needs, and they're simply a match there. So they're then also allowing for people to use them as Greek gods so that people can live out their own process through them. That's why people get so invested in celebrities or whatever. We elevate them because they mean something to us. They represent something. So we do it in all levels, right? It's even when you admire someone in your life, it's the same process. So we just externalize whenever we feel that someone represents something that's important to us. And it's just that. It's still these people becoming symbols of the kind of tribe they represent, and they are able to strike a chord that resonates with a lot of people. And they're not able to do what they do unless they have the support. So, again, people, and most people don't want to admit this, but a lot of people want to be oppressed. It's part of belonging to a hierarchy. It's just like many people, they like, for instance, at work, if they have a tough boss. Some people don't, but many people do. They want strong leadership because they respond to that. They can feel that this person can protect me. If I'm on his team, we will kick ass, right? It's tribal, but it's who we are as humans. And then some people are not. But we need to understand that most people operate on that level. So that idea of having strong leaders and Greek gods, it's just part of where humans still are. Democracy is a little bit too boring, right? Because it's about finding solutions. It's not about that personified representation of whoever you want to be. Any other questions?
So we have a question from my colleague here, Aki.
Yeah. I just wondered, what are the odds for a nuclear war coming? And if so, would there be biological or chemical, bombs or stuff like that also could impact, more zombie-like states with stronger aggression and whatever?
Right. Okay. What's interesting around this is understand that war is, first of all, a psychological war. And understand that this war that we are in right now has been going on for decades in different ways. And remember that Russia's manipulation of the West has been going on for more than 20 years, especially through cyber warfare. And they thought that now we can get away with stuff because they've gotten away with stuff before. So now, when it comes to the chance of nuclear war, I would say it's relatively slim. And the reason is that Russia is threatening and all that, but it's what they do. Everybody knows that will be suicide. And it's not the smartest thing to do. So anyone will try to avoid that. What they're testing now, and this is also part of what China is doing, is how will the West respond? Trying to figure out the response kind of psychology and see, okay, how far can we push it? Russia's been doing this for decades and trying to figure out how, what they can get away with, with surgical precision. So, and it's been very clear that this, they will not get away with it, because the thing is, one could argue that, yeah, if for instance, Russia bombs the West, then the West will just take it out of fear to not escalate, because we've been seen in the West as quite weak. That it's all about peace, and we will do anything. And in Europe, we've been looked at as extremely cowardice, that we're not willing to protect our own borders, and that we just will take anything out of fear of escalation. So there's been calculations on the Russian side that, yeah, they would probably not respond because they would be too afraid of the consequences. And now they're starting to understand that that's not true. So it's changing. So I would say that the chance of a nuclear war is less now than it was a few years ago. Because the discussion, remember also when there's war, there's also release of tension. This is why this war will go on for quite some time, because there's a lot of tension that needs to be released. I've talked about this earlier, but COVID is also part of this war. It's not from the conspiracy theories thing, it's the opposite. I said the vibration and purpose of COVID is to drain conflict energy because of this. So it's the whole planet being part of this discussion, right? Being part of lifting the consciousness, and COVID is also a part of that. So we always have to look at reality also beyond human culture, because humans are, one life form of this planet, but there are also different levels of life that is also involved in that journey, in that elevation of collective consciousness, not just for humans, but for themselves too. Remember that for all other life forms, humans represent a huge threat, right? So to also be part of humans trying to find a path where they can finally become less destructive would be beneficial for everyone. So it's a collective project, and it's working. So, and with the current administration in the States, like, what's interesting when you look at what's going on behind the scenes, they've been extremely efficient in their communication. And the United States, through the current administration, they have invested a lot in intelligence and the military, so their kind of presence has been restored, which means that they're playing again. They're on the field, and they're doing some very smart things, and it's being noticed. So it's now a war on so many different levels. But on that level, they see it as sport. It's really interesting when I talk with people from the intelligence communities that they see it as sport. They think it's fun, They get excited because it's what they do. And in many ways, it is sport. Sport and war is the same thing, right? It's like in sport, fewer people die, but it's still kind of the same thing, right? And it's so that's also a peaceful way of trying to work out conflicts, because this is why also sport can become so serious, right? It is war, and you hate the other team and their people because we're tribal, right? So there's a lot of that going on. So the physical war in Ukraine is in many ways the least interesting part of this war. It's everything else. And humans have to, and also like normal people, have to grow into the understanding that a war today is not really that. It's everything else. And it's going on in a very broad sense. And everybody's in on it. So this is, in many ways, a full-scale world war, but fought in different ways than we're used to.
So as we begin wrapping up this episode, but clearly not the last time we'll be talking about World War III, as students working with you, one of the most fascinating parts of this unfolding conflict that you've talked about before is that this isn't the first time we've kind of played out this conflict in this way on this planet. That this really long cycle leading up to a decision point in our human evolution of sort of self-annihilation or continued growth and evolution has occurred before. Not that you necessarily need to go into detail about it, but how does that context help us to understand the spiritual significance of this moment?
I think the longer lines and the big cycles, understanding that all the tests we get that we don't pass, we have to repeat them. And it's not about the tests in themselves, it's about what we learn. Just like in school, it's about learning and growing. And understand that this planet and humans are not that advanced, and they're not supposed to be. So it's never about trying to avoid this or that. It's about embracing the fact that individuals incarnate as humans to work out course or karma, and also to accelerate quickly if they want to, because the human life form can hold such a big kind of spectrum of consciousness. And that's really interesting and wonderful. But yes, of course, humans have gone through this many times before, and when you look at the family of species that humans belong to, yes, this has also happened in other planets that are connected to our culture. So, many of the cultures that are kind of visiting here on a permanent basis, they've been there, they've done that, they've gone through it, and some of them have self-destructed at this point. As I said, most cultures, most civilizations and life forms, they will self-destruct at this point in their culture because they have too many weapons and too little intelligence, which is exactly where humans are at. But that's the test. And to move forward and gradually build a world where everybody is invited, where everybody is included. Because our current world, our current civilization is certainly not that. There are more slaves in the world than at any other time in human history. This current civilization has basically destroyed the environment and killed off close to 50% of all life forms on this planet, and keeps going because we just want to buy cheap shit. And for some reason, we want to create a class of extremely rich people who control everything. All of that, it's not, we will need to grow and move into something better. As I've talked about so many times, that there are more advanced individuals incarnating as humans, more than ever. And that is the big shift. It's not that, the atmas or souls incarnating into humans are still on the same level. They leave, and the human life form is basically the same, but more advanced consciousness is incarnating. And that is what will change everything, and it is changing everything. It is happening. And with that, it means you get a different way of thinking. Many young people belonging to that level, they're already there where everyone's included. Sure, everybody should have their voice. It's not even a question. They're not tribal anymore. Many are, but also, I'm talking about the ones representing the new consciousness. So it's not that we will have to be convinced. It's simply that the old people die, and that the more advanced consciousness gradually moves in and takes over, and it is happening. So this is, the cramps of the old civilization, of the old paradigm, of the old ways of thinking, just doing its thing, right? And the world will get better. It always does. Always. When you look at human history, and when you even look at, the current civilization over the last, few thousand years, that is one thing we can definitely say, that life always gets better. So this civilization with that gear shift will continue to become better, but now it will have to include everyone. Everyone will demand the same rights, the same freedom to express themselves. And that will grow so that the current type of democracy will have to go. The same with dictatorships. Humans, based on a higher level of consciousness, will come up with something better. It will take time. But humans and human culture, when it becomes global, over time will become a place for everyone. It doesn't mean that there will be no conflicts, but it will be different. The journey for humans have barely started. 200 years from now, when we look back at these times, is like when we today look back at the Stone Ages. The difference will be that big. Human civilization will change dramatically and radically in the next 200 years in ways humans today cannot even begin to imagine, and it will all be better. And if you reincarnate, you can see with your own eyes. This journey, that this is both the end and the beginning of, is absolutely magnificent. And see it as necessary, and also saying, finally, we are going past this old paradigm, because we cannot, remember that human history up to now has been based on certain values, certain ways of behaving and thinking and being. It's okay when we exist in small groups and where everything is small scale. But it doesn't mean that it can work when we're billions and billions of people. Then we have to move into a society where everything is sustainable, everything is recycled, and where we work in harmony with nature and each other, and that's where we are moving. This is simply just the old consciousness fighting itself and fighting its own mirror image, because none of the models today are truly working. Humans are working. We as essence, as people, as beings, we are working, and our paths and our consciousness will have to open up, and because of that, human life will change. So there's absolutely no reason to be afraid. Once you connect with the movement and change of consciousness on this planet, you will feel very clearly that there is a lift beginning. It will take time. As I said, all that old karma will have to be worked out, but that is happening. So don't hold on. Look forward. Focus on where the world is heading, and try to be an example of the values that we are moving into. Try to represent a spiritual presence that respects everything and everyone, that includes everyone, and that emanates love, no matter what they do, no matter where they're coming from, no matter what belief system or politics, or no matter what it is. We're on this very tiny planet together. And it's about time that we recognize that. and that every single being, not just humans, but every single life form and level of life on this planet can live not just in harmony, but work together. And humans are the key. We have to grow into a consciousness of love and wanting to nurture and support each other. So start with your own life. It's always where we got to start. In our own family, in our own house, in our own relationships. Build, nurture, take responsibility, lift, see past differences because they're not important. Love is. And remember, everyone has the right to walk their path the way that is right for them. Your opinions don't matter. Your love does. And that's truly how we can meet the current situation. It's just letting go of the old and opening ourselves for a version of this planet and human civilization that will finally grow up.
Thank you, IKYA. Thank you all for joining us. And keep your eye out. We will have future episodes about the unfoldment of World War III and the Ukraine war. We are back every Monday at 7 o'clock Oslo time, both live on YouTube. But if you would like to be able to more directly engage and ask questions, do sign up for the Zoom link. Again, my name is Andy, and we will see you next Monday at 7 o'clock. This has been IKYA Live, World News from the Spiritual Perspective.